And hi, I'm Steve Barnes from George Mason University, and welcome back, everybody. Really excited to have so many joining. I'm sitting here actually admitting more from the waiting room as we go, yeah, we're looking forward to it. I'm going to. Did I hit record? I hit record. Okay. Cynthia, why don't I let you get us started?
Yeah, this semester we are wanting to sort of course, keep tabs on Russia's war with Ukraine. We'll be meeting, actually, Steve and I were just talking about this. We'll be meeting on the 1-year anniversary of the war a little bit later this month. But we also wanted to broaden out, right? We realized that in a way, talking about this war has made us realize that there are all kinds of important issues to consider in terms of 21st century threats to democracy. As a result, I mean, and some of these threats were mentioned by the director of the CIA just yesterday. In particular, he identified the Israel-Palestine the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as one. I mean, many of you guys, I'm sure, have seen the recent headlines about some kind of Chinese spy satellite like hanging over Montana. I know that my colleagues in the history department at Holy Cross are really going out of their minds about like sort of the inroads that this artificial intelligence technology, particularly this program ChatGPT, has made amongst students. I mean, students even in junior high school, never mind in college. And again, that may be sort of a stretch to connect something like ChatGPT to Russia's war in Ukraine. But again, I think this semester we are looking at threats to democracy and challenges that the contemporary world is facing, and a state and society's like use of technology is one of those challenges. So what we're planning to do, at least for the next 3 months, is to start off every month with a session that Steve and I will sort of wrap with you guys individually. And then we'll have guests for the remaining 3 weeks of the month. The first guests we'll try to keep to sort of Ukrainian, Russian focus. And then the 2 later guests we will venture further afield with. So for instance, coming up next week, we may have a guest talking about internet warfare or something, but again, kind of specifically related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then the week after, we're going to have an amazing guest, Professor Brandon Friedman, who is the director of research at the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University. And he's going to be talking about Iran, Russia's relationship with Iran, also the protests inside Iran, also Russia's influence in the wider Middle East, including efforts that are being made by some Middle Eastern countries to wash sort of Russian oil and gas into the global economy. And generally sort of like the changing situation of Middle Eastern security issues. So we think that will be absolutely fascinating and something that you should not miss. And we also hope to have another session on China with another very prominent guest who does a lot of work for the BBC, and so on. And we're also planning to send you programs sort of a little bit in advance so you can see what lies ahead. And we'll hope you'll be open to learning more about, again, different challenges around the world. So today the 2 of us are gonna sort of refocus though on the situation between in Ukraine, in Russia, the course of the war, and take your questions, observations, thoughts about that you've had during like our couple of months off. And so we'll start off with a couple of observations of our own. And I think I'll toss to Steve, because I think that he has been, again, following the conflict, thinking about it, agonizing over it, and he'll start us off with some food for thought.
Fantastic. Thanks, Cynthia. Yeah, we're definitely hoping to get the guests scheduled and out to you. That in part, I have to say, is on me. I'm still working on it. I wrote a crazy 20,000 plus word report on our Russian and Eurasian Studies program for our academic program review here, and that took me way more time than what I was expecting. But I'm really excited about this semester. I'm just ecstatic to see that we have 61 people here. So many folks have come back to join us again. I hope that means that you found our conversations last semester really useful. And we were just talking before, we're going to hope to do something kind of special on February 24th, since it'll be the 1-year anniversary, and maybe have some colleagues of ours in the field sort of think about how this has all sort of changed us, I think, in the last year. But I thought I would just take a few minutes and talk a little bit about, what I see of what's happened since we were last together in early December. I think what we see if we look at maps of the war is that there's been relatively little movement since that time. But this doesn't mean that the war has reached a stalemate. It doesn't mean that the war has been calm by any stretch. It's still been incredibly brutal and violent. And there's a lot of speculation, frankly, about what's going to happen going forward. We've seen some signs of some Russian success, actually, around Bakhmut, but something that's been coming at incredible costs in terms of lives lost. So they're just really grisly reports of the number of bodies that, frankly, are just being thrown at Ukrainian forces in this region. There's still significant and I think uncertain answers to questions over whether taking Bakhmut has significance strategically, or if it's just a matter of the Wagner group in particular, this mercenary group under Prigozhin, trying to show some kind of success to the Russian public, to the Russian government. So, we're going to have to see what happens there, but I'm definitely reading lots of things that say that we might need to expect the possibility that Russia will take Bakhmut in the coming weeks. But there are different reports, I would say, overall, everything that I'm reading on how things are going in general. We definitely see fears of a renewed Russian offensive. There are a lot of reports that Russia has learned from its mistakes over the last year and that it is fighting better than what it did a year ago. That's certainly something that we should expect. We shouldn't pretend that the Russians are just, stupid. They're definitely learning from the mistakes that they made, and we should expect that Ukrainian forces are, of course, learning from what's happened over the course of this time as well. But we see fears of the possibility of a renewed offensive coming out of Belarus. I see sort of differing accounts whether whether this seems to be really possible. They seem to be sending a lot of these mobilized soldiers to Belarus for training. There's some indication that maybe they're just trying to keep Ukrainian forces sort of on alert and keep them away from other parts of the front line by forcing them to defend that border. So I don't know what's going to happen there. There are reports of a new round of mobilization of soldiers in Russia that maybe has started in a quiet way, but that is coming in a major way again. So we'll see what kind of impacts that we have there. So there are some who say, we should actually expect some Russian successes in the coming months. There are others, though, that are reporting a coming Ukrainian offensive, and that, in fact, the winter has been about Ukraine preparing and softening up Russian forces for an offensive. Claims made by, not just Ukrainians, but by outside observers that Ukraine will liberate all of its people in the coming year. It seems to me, I think all of this speculation right now is probably typical of a time when a war is not exactly stalemated, but there's been reduced movement, right? So we had those incredible moments when Russia was forced to pull back from Kiev, from the Ukrainian north, from around Kharkiv, the liberation of Kherson, that gave us an indication of a direction that the war was going. And we don't have those kind of major changes happening right now, which I think just sort of leaves us open to a lot of speculation. And I think we just don't know. And I'm not sure there is a way for us to know. I follow a lot of respected military analysts, and they disagree among themselves about what's going to happen going forward. But what I think is clear to me, at least, is that this war is going to go on for a while, right? We're nowhere near an end point. We're nowhere near a point when either side is interested in some kind of negotiation to bring the war to an end. It's becoming, I think, increasingly, it's going to become a war of production, of the ability to continue to produce ammunition or to receive ammunition from outside supporters. But I think it's also a war of nerves. It's a war about resilience, about who can last, about whether the West will continue to provide military support to Ukraine for the amount of time that is going to take, about whether there is that kind of patience in democracies. There has been news, of course, of late of the United States and European allies providing tanks to Ukraine. This is a significant development, though it does seem that it will take some time to train up Ukrainian forces and before those tanks start to arrive. But maybe that's at least a sign of an ongoing commitment. There has been, and I'm going to actually share a link for you in the chat. There was a really interesting article today in The Guardian about the energy war. And it basically shows that there's been tremendous progress in Europe of getting off of their dependence on Russian natural gas. And the shifts in terms of both conservation, but also in terms of seeking out other sources of energy, has been really quite remarkable. So I definitely encourage you to take a read at that. But I think, this raises the sort of significant ongoing questions about the economic side of the war, about how the Russian economy is surviving sanctions, about the impacts that all of this is having on the Russian economy, about whether and to what extent import from Europe and the United States is being replaced by import through China or through India or through other third parties, right? So countries may be importing things and then sending them to Russia. There does seem to be some indication that Russia is still getting a lot of products with microchips and things like this that they can make use of. So I think this is definitely one of the questions, and Cynthia and I have been seeking the right person to come to talk to us about this. I'm definitely open to suggestions, by the way, if anybody has them, if you know of people who would be really good to talk to us about the economic side of the war, because it's an area where, although I read a lot about it, I feel sort of at a loss to kind of fully understand it. But I think, all of this just sort of speaks to the fact that Putin still believes that authoritarianism will outlast democracy. And I think there's no doubt that Russia took pleasure in things that we have seen since we were last together in early December, like the attack from Bolsonaro supporters on the newly elected government in Brazil, or the incredible dysfunction, of course, that was apparent with the fight over the Speaker of the House in the United States, a fight that we shouldn't ignore was led in part by people who are hostile to continued U.S. support for Ukraine. And so, I think there's lots of reasons that Cynthia and I want to broaden out our discussions even more this semester. We believe that the resilience, the staying power of democracy itself is under threat, and that this threat is perhaps the greatest danger to Ukraine's victory in this war. But naturally, we think about it, in a far broader way than that, right? It's simply a key question for all of us, a key challenge for all of us. What does democracy even mean in this contemporary moment? Is there still a commitment to democracy within democratic countries? I think these questions are simply critical to us as citizens, as as thinkers. Russia's war on Ukraine is both a symptom of a world reconfigured, but it is also doing a great deal of reconfiguring. And I think the dramatic shifts, by the way, that you see in European energy consumption that happen so quickly, that are apparent in that article, that's just one of the most obvious signs of the way that the world is being reshaped by all of this. If we even then begin to think forward, I think, to scenarios of what it looks like when the war is over, it's impossible to imagine that we're returning back to the world as it was before February 24th, 2022. So yeah, I mean, we're going to talk about the war certainly, but we think that opening up a much larger discussion is something that we need to do, and we really want to do with you, and we really want to encourage your participation in these discussions, because Cynthia and I, we don't pretend that we have answers to all of these questions, but we really find it important to talk with friends like you about these kinds of questions. I'll stop there, Cynthia.
Yeah, well, I mean, I second everything you said. I think that one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot during our break is exactly this issue of what is democracy, and what do people around the world sort of understand democracy to be. I think we're grappling. I mean, I've told my students this for many years prior to Russia's invasion. I think we're grappling with a problematic era that in many ways sort of resembles the years between the two great wars, which saw the rise of these like great dictators like Mussolini and Hitler and Stalin, who were able to marshal a great deal of popularity from their citizenry, right? And I think that like we are struggling with like what to do with the ability of leaders to marshal technology, right? Tactics of surveillance, new strategies of media manipulation to build and enforce consent, right? So leading to the establishment of authoritarian regimes that can lay a claim to an element of mass support, right? And thus tell their own citizens or advertise themselves to the world as in some way democratic, right? And then the US in criticizing them as being kind of undemocratic, right? Not, as it were, like not acknowledging the will of the people, or the ideas of the people, or the beliefs of the people in these different countries. And this is going to be a difficult thing for the United States to negotiate. But so what I just in my little food for thought, again, I'm fascinated and bewildered and worried about the position of the individual citizen in an authoritarian regime in the 21st century, and wondering if that role of the citizen has become, like, in a way, even more constrained than it was in other periods like the 20s and 30s. I don't know, but I am thinking about this problem, not just in terms of what options the ordinary Russian citizen has in terms of challenging like the functioning of the Putin regime, but also again, like what the power ordinary people have to affect change in a lot of countries around the world. This is especially sort of front and center for me right now because I'm teaching Soviet history. And I have just assigned my students to read a novel that I highly recommend to all of you. It's little known in the United States and very unjustly so. And it's short, but it's called We, and it's by a Soviet author named Yevgeny Zamyatin. Maybe Steve can put that in the chat while I keep on talking here. But Zamyatin is an interesting figure because he was a Bolshevik, like a follower of Lenin before Lenin seized power, right? He was imprisoned many times, very committed to this idea of building a more egalitarian world. But once Lenin seized power and then waged sort of a 4-year civil war to kind of consolidate that, he quickly became disillusioned with Bolshevik tactics of enforcing conformity. And so as early as 1921, he writes this futuristic novel that's set in some kind of police state, like an indeterminate like year in the future that and he does this again before like Soviet repression has really taken the shape that we all recognize, right? So he's very prescient in some of the things that he anticipates. And as a result of this novel, which was smuggled out to the West for publication, like Zamyatin is exiled and dies in poverty in Paris. But thinking about Zamyatin's We, written in 1921, and then Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which came 10 years after in 1931. I think it's fascinating to look at the different mechanisms authors are identifying for building consent, right? And in Zamyatin's We is sort of a more traditional way of looking at a dangerous totalitarian regime. Like there's a universal surveillance, right? And an idea of getting like citizens to have to police on one another. And everybody lives in glass house, for instance, a glass apartment. It's like your life is supposed to be transparent, right? So that people can see what you're doing at any time if they so choose. In Brave New World, it's a little bit more complicated and maybe even more disturbing, because there Huxley's really talking about how easy it is to placate most people, to create sort of the illusion of freedom by allowing them, say, to consume or to have access to easy entertainment and sensory gratification. And one of his powerful statements in that book is that like 99 out of 100 people, if not more, are always going to appreciate, choose something that is like sort of pleasing and simple rather than difficult and complex. So why am I talking about this? Well, I'm also remembering back to our discussion last year with Steve's colleague who was talking about China. And after our public discussion, Steve and I were talking with him a while on our own. And I asked him, like, so do you really believe that ordinary people in China don't have the power to affect significant political change, or even to agitate successfully for something like an end to being locked up in your own apartment if you have COVID? And he said, no to the first, yes to the second. Meaning, like, in his opinion, ordinary people cannot just simply from the bottom up affect like political transformation of a entrenched autocratic regime like we see in China. What they can do, the most they can hope to do is to ameliorate one or another particular policy, right? And so I was thinking about this then in terms of Russia. One of the things that I did over the break was at the behest of my dad. So shout out to Dad, who I think is in the audience here. I watched a film, a 2022 film, so a very new film called Navalny that was produced by HBO Max and CNN. And it tells the story that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, but even for me, like I knew all the sort of details of what it narrated. It was very powerful to actually see Navalny on screen so much and hear him talking and see his like unscripted interactions with his wife and get a sense of, you know, his personality aside from his role as like a big political dissident. So, you know, he is the leading political dissident in Russia, and he's been imprisoned for over a year, right? And I couldn't help thinking, like, here's this guy. He has done some incredible investigative reporting of upper level Kremlin corruption, right? And one of his videos in particular called Putin's Palace that tries to expose some hidden corruption on the part of Russia's current president, you know, has garnered like hundreds of millions of views. And then, you know, there's this documentary about him that has got like 2 kind of global media corporations behind it. And yet his suffering inside Russia day to day is invisible. And this makes me think of like the kind of conundrum, the moral conundrum we see when we think about something like Stalin's Great Terror, something, you know, which was a wave of repression in the 1930s, but something that's always really confounded historians is that during that time, so many people appeared to confess to crimes that they did not commit, crimes that didn't happen, and certainly crimes that they were not involved in. And so everybody's always asked themselves, like, well, why did all these people like confess to these things? And there are complicated, you know, explanations for that. But one is definitely like this idea of like how much harder it is to suffer for the sake of what you believe is right if nobody sees it, nobody knows about it. I mean, for those of you, you know, who've read the New Testament, like, you know, even Jesus Christ, like, had the, you know, he's got to die, but like, he at least knew that, like, you know, in his belief system, if he died, the entire world would be saved. So he like did have this sense that like his suffering might actually be important for some larger purpose, right? What Navalny is kind of going through now, and what the sort of the danger of like these regimes, I think, often is that this fear that, like, you know, once they arrest you, once you're in prison, it's not just that you're expected to suffer, it's that nobody talks about you anymore. Nobody can see you anymore. You know, you can't even become a martyr because your voice can't be heard anymore, right? And so it's this idea, it's sort of, I think, very, very unfair for those of us who are not inside that kind of system to sort of expect people to be willing to sort of suffer in silence like that. And then I'm thinking about like a less dramatic example, and with that, I'll you know, wrap my long-winded, you know, food for thought up. But if we're looking at Russian society as a whole, right, we've really only seen, and very disappointingly so, only seen like kind of one very big moment where it looked like, you know, political control was maybe not necessarily weakening, but where there was like a certain signs of like real like social upheaval. And that was in September of last year when Russia announced a mobilization of new recruits, right? Like the idea was they needed to get 200 or 300,000 new guys in the ranks. And that resulted in this huge exodus of men from Russia. And it wasn't the first exodus, it's called the third wave of emigration, but it was the biggest. And there were, you know, we all remember those dramatic lines in front of the Georgian border, and there's incredible statistics, like the very first week alone, 98,000 Russians crossed into Kazakhstan just through official border crossings, and there's all kinds of unofficial ways to get there. And And, it's very difficult to measure, but like estimates range anywhere from like 500,000 to 700,000 Russians left the country as a result of that, mobilization call up. But I think now it's been, almost 6 months, right, since that time. I'm actually maybe only 5 months. I'm losing my ability to do basic math, but people who fled are now having to make some really difficult choices, right? Many of the men and families who fled hadn't ever left the country, right? And they went to places like Central Asia, to Kyrgyzstan, Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, where rents soared and they had no savings, no money. I mean, no way at all to support themselves for very long, certainly not legally, and no way of really doing anything for money that would garner them more than just, a few pennies, basically. And so many of these people have returned, or if they haven't returned, they are in absolutely desperate straits by now. Even more privileged people who had like what's called a Schengen visa, meaning a visa that allows them to travel to the EU. That is good for 3 months. So they are now illegal immigrants if they haven't returned home or applied for refugee status, and that requires like living in confined places and not doing any other work and waiting for a very long time to have a court like review your status. And so just to, again, follow up to one more story, I know I told you all about my partner's cousin, right, who lived in St. Petersburg and had to make a big decision whether to stay or to go. And he was told that he was in category 1, like because he was an officer when he did his required military service and he's in the medical profession. And when, word came out in September 21st, I mean, we were like, go, go, go. You've got to get out of there. Like the borders could close. You can't kill Ukrainians and you can't be morally implicated in this. And he left, and he has 3 children. He has parents alive. His wife has parents alive, and he left, and he was a lucky one, like incredibly lucky comparatively. He has a sister-in-law in Spain. He has a Polish grandmother, and he had grown disillusioned with the Putin regime way back in 2014. So he had already started a process of applying for Polish residency, and that was recently granted. And my partner was able to send him some money, not a lot, but like more than other people had access to. So he had these tools, and yet his family is trying to figure out what to do. He doesn't speak Polish. He's a medical worker, and even to requalify, even slightly, to like be able to work in a medical profession, like he needs to have his documents in Russia, like copied, officially translated and certified, just so the people in like Poland, or Spain or wherever can see, like what he achieved, and then like tell him what classes he needs to take to requalify as even someone who just like, works in an ambulance. And this is aside from the language barriers. He learned Polish like as a baby, but he doesn't remember anything. So he's like, trying to think about like, can he ever like actually effectively work in Poland? And his wife, who he loves and has 3 kids, like, and is a very good person, likes her life in St. Petersburg, right? And is skeptical about how they can effectively build a life abroad, right? She's got 3 kids in school, and she's trying to, get them on the debate team, get them to go skiing. She's started working. She's about to go full time. She was a housewife. She's taking care of both sets of older parents. And I can like sneer at this a little bit and like bemoan her lack of courage and think of her as like kind of a citizen, like in Brave New World, who thinks a lot about consumption and entertainment and like easy happiness, and is willing to choose that rather than like, open her eyes to this larger society that she's living in and the horrible things it's doing. But I just have a terrible feeling that if that were me, I would be hesitating as well. I mean, and I would be trying to justify, staying in my post as a teacher, maybe trying to have contact with younger people. I mean, it's a big deal to give up your job and leave and go abroad. So I welcome any of your observations on that. But I think that one of the things that we should really think about this semester is how hard it is for alternative voices to be heard and for people to feel like that they have like, an effective shot at implementing change.
Thanks, Cynthia. Everybody, if you would like to comment or ask questions, please do raise your hand. I just have a couple of thoughts. I listened to an interview with Leonid Volkov earlier this week. He is Navalny's chief of staff. He was speaking at George Washington University here in DC. And he was talking a little bit about the mobilization that happened in the fall. And I think one of the important things to keep in mind about all of this, of course, is that it's the people who really didn't have resources who are the ones that ended up mobilized, who ended up in the military because they didn't have the capacity to get out. The Russian government tried actually through that period to encourage people to voluntarily register for the military, and very, very few were willing to do so. And I think all of these things certainly say something. The other response that I have, just sort of thinking about it, is that we not forget ever that there is a much bigger story of people who have been forced out of their country in terms of Ukrainian refugees. And all of the things that you're talking about, we have a huge population of people going through. And so I think one of the things that, as we're talking about guests to have, I'd love to have somebody who could talk to us more about, what the experiences and impacts and things like this are of refugee populations, of the populations of Russians who have left. I'm really curious about sort of encounters between the two that have perhaps happened as at times they're winding up in the same countries. The last response I have, just thinking about some of the early comments you were making, and I kind of make this observation kind of offhand sometimes when I'm teaching Soviet history, but it's really worth us kind of thinking about more seriously, and I think we will as we're talking this semester. Imagine how grateful Joseph Stalin would have been to have the kinds of surveillance technologies that are available today, and to have the kind of information that we all give up freely, that we give up in order to, use the internet for free to get discounts in our shopping, all of these kinds of things. And I think, this AI stuff, obviously we've been talking about it here. We're going to have a lunch discussion among my faculty colleagues here in our department here in a couple of weeks about what we think the impacts of ChatGPT are going to be in our classroom and how we're going to deal with it. And but all of these things I think really sort of it's all kind of raising the bar on this question of what all of this technology means and what it's doing, and we feel it certainly as instructors, but I think it's actually a much bigger and broader question than even that. Stan, go ahead.
Well, a couple of 30-second questions, and I did put a question in the chat. First thing, you mentioned AI. AI always looks backward. If you think about it, AI is not creative. It depends on the past in order to get models to think about how it would answer a question. Mm-hmm. So AI so you got to think about AI that way. That's part one. The other thing is, Cynthia raises a good point, but in the United States, you talk to a politician, all politics are local, all elections are local. Therefore, it's very hard to get out of your local bent, and only discussions like this get us to think about other places in the world. Mm. So I'll just leave it at there. But my question, which is in the chat, is this week there was, well, last week there was some articles in the Times about these Russian convicts who lived through the through their fights in Ukraine are now going back into Russian society. You guys are really experts on Russian society. What's going to happen when they go back?
So let me take a stab at it and do so as a historian. Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, and less than 3 weeks later, they announced a massive amnesty, which reduced the population of the Gulag, of the Soviet forced labor camp system, by about 50%. So it was a huge number of people. Well over 1 million people were released. And the interesting sort of result of this, right? Because I think sometimes we want to think, oh, you know, at a moment like this, and you know, in history, you know, Stalin died, the Gulag is being reduced in size. Like, surely the attitude of the population is hurrah, liberation at last, right? But in fact, what happened, and there's a really brilliant book by a historian named Miriam Dobson, a very close friend actually of Cynthia's and mine, on this subject. There was a massive crime wave that took place across the Soviet Union, in part because these people were being released without a lot in terms of means to get home. But then the bigger question of what were they going to do once they got back to the homes that they were in, right? So there was all kinds of difficulties for these kinds of people to get jobs. You know, they had kind of a black mark on their record, these kinds of things. And so the overwhelming sort of response of the population wasn't, you know, yippee, we're free, but it was like, send them back. You know, what are you doing letting these people go? And, you know, I mean, the situation isn't precisely analogous here, obviously, but I think there is the possibility that some of these people return, that they're going to have difficulties, you know, finding employment, and that this is going to lead to additional crime. You know, whether that will be big enough and significant enough to be noticed by the population, and the extent to which information will get out, and all of these kinds of things, you know, I think it's really sort of interesting to see what happens. But you know, liberation of large numbers of people from imprisonment can often have these kinds of consequences. Go ahead, Cynthia. Sorry.
Oh, not at all. I mean, I think that leads to other questions too. I mean, one of which you raised yourself, Steve, like the extent to which Putin's regime has been effective at keeping this war okay, let me rephrase. Successful at keeping the more privileged sections of particularly the population in Moscow and St. Petersburg kind of insulated from like how this war is being fought and who's doing the fighting, I think is huge and really important. And so I think like a lot of soldiers are like coming out of small villages, countryside, the Far East, ethnic republics, and then they'll be returning back there. So Stan, not just to like, you know, I'd sort of take your question and expand on it. Like, I think we're going to see, like, the longer this goes on, the more fraught situations in Russian society are going to become, right? Because you're going to be seeing like demobilized veterans coming back and just like, and they're going to be like brutalized as hell, you know, and you know, and implicated in like incredibly nasty things. And I mean, we know from history that there's going to be sort of massive PTSD and issues about like how well they're going to acclimate to being back in like a ostensibly law-abiding society, especially when they're facing, if they face like, you know, not the best economic prospects, because then, you know, they get angry, right? Just look at like German soldiers after World War I or something like that. You know, the whole lost generation. And so I think that there's that question. And then also, again, looking at history, we've brought this up before last semester, but often now, looking back at the collapse of the Soviet Union, people identify, right, like disillusionment around the Soviet war in Afghanistan as sort of a very important moment. Not even just in terms of like numbers of soldiers killed, but in terms of like really making it very clear to the population the extent to which they were being lied to and the disregard that the regime had for like the fate of ordinary soldiers. Only 30,000 soldiers died in Soviet soldiers died in the war in Afghanistan, which went on for about 10 years. And that number has been far and away surpassed already in Ukraine. So people have been saying, like, at some point, families are going to get like upset. And again, if we're talking predominantly poor families with, as per my like long ramble at the beginning, not a lot of options and not a lot of belief that whatever they say can affect the system. Right now, it seems like that local governments have been fairly good at kind of buying off widows or like, giving people some kind of like financial benefit or promise of such to sort of muffle, upset about the fact that like a husband or a son is coming back in a coffin. But at some point, the scale of the casualties is going to be such that that starts to slip. And in the Soviet case, it was the mothers of these Afghanistan fighters, right, that really started to make a difference, and they started to speak out. And there is something about women speaking out that does seem historically in Russian history, to make people listen a little bit more than they might otherwise. And so I think that is potentially a moment of fissure, is when like the families, particularly the mothers and wives, start like speaking out more forcefully. But again, like Steve is saying, Stalin would have like loved the technological control that leaders can have today, because like there's TV. So, mothers can be like really agitating in Irkutsk in, Eastern Siberia, and it's going to be, like a little bit muffled. Who hears about it and how they hear about it is going to have a lot to do with like, was a Western journalist there? And, and like, how is this information disseminated, right? I mean, there is, as long as there's like a lot of control over Russian TV by the Russian government, even getting local protests really, really heard and appreciated is going to be an issue.
Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. From what I understand, I think the real problem with returning veterans are from the Wagner group, which are basically the scourings of the prison system. And as a former president said, these are not good hombres. And I don't think the experience in the colonies or at the front has been a rehabilitative one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, I mean, and I think we all probably know enough about the whole system of thieves in law and Russian gangs that which have been imported into our countries. I think that this is going to be a real problem. Yes, for your average sort of draftee that goes back home to his native village, that's perhaps less of a problem. Although maybe, I think, some of them probably, after they've seen the lights of Moscow, do they really want to go back to wherever it is in the Ural or in Siberia? So that, yeah, there's going to be this whole sort of group of discontented veterans. And also, I don't think, and after, like in both our countries, after World War II, there was a whole system of veterans benefits, which actually was very good. But if you don't have these, I don't think there's any GI Bill or Veterans Assistance Act operating in Russia.
And I think that that's brilliant. I was just thinking as you were talking that because I was watching Russian TV this morning, in preparation for this meeting to sort of see again how they were spinning the war, and it's amazing, like the rhetoric that they have of victory and of voluntarism and of all these soldiers finding like what they're being asked to do like very, very meaningful and fulfilling. And in a way, when you think about it, if this is the language in which it's all been framed, it becomes like very difficult, like resources aside, that's a whole other problem, but it becomes very difficult to address like problems like post-traumatic stress and trauma and the risk of like alcoholism and domestic violence. And, because if you've failed to acknowledge that this was really anything other than like a heroic war of self-defense, and that any of these people were doing anything except like the most noble of actions, right? It's difficult to even offer services that might help people, through negotiate some of the ugliness that they've seen. Right. In a way, the regime can get kind of caught in its own propaganda to a certain extent in that way. Another thing that I think is really interesting in a larger sense is this growing conflict between Prigozhin. I mean, again, because I think we need to also like sort of look for like how and when there can be regime change in Russia. And this conflict between Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner group, and like the current Russian military does also seem to be like leading to some tensions behind the scenes. I really recommend to you guys this podcast by a guy named Mark Galeotti, who is called In Russia's Shadows. And he's a really good analyst, and I agree with a lot of his assessment. But he had this very interesting point in the most recent episode where he said that that he believes in a way the system of what he calls Putinism is dead, which meaning like, people sort of voluntarily like believing in like kind of great Russia, Putin, Russia acting nobly in the world to defend conservative values. He said that it's sort of become, its falsity has become clear. People aren't like voluntarily buying in, but he said that the irony and the scary thing about this is that the system can maybe be dead, but it can still endure for a very long time without like enough of a shock to like force some kind of major personnel change or something like that, if that makes sense. I mean, and again, I think maybe an allusion would be like to the Brezhnev era, where sort of the ideology was getting very like hollow and corruption of the Soviet leaders were clear, but in a way, there was a certain stability to this like hollow shell of that allowed it to like carry on for quite some time.
In thinking about, Cynthia, your point about where will there be a moment when wives and mothers stand up? In part for that to happen, they have to recognize this war as unjust. Because if not, they see the loss of their sons or husbands as something that was heroic and was acceptable. And, I'm just thinking about like, the difference in Afghanistan versus World War II, right? So many more people died in World War II, but you don't have the same kind of outrage because it was seen by most as a just war. World War II also makes me think, about this question of returning veterans. And so we saw, even in the midst of Stalin's Soviet Union, one of the most oppressive regimes in history, we actually see some really significant impact from returning veterans after that war. So there's another really terrific book. Elena Zubkova has written a book called, I think it's called Russia After the War, right?
Lost Illusions.
Yeah, and she writes about this desire on the part of returning veterans for some softening of this dictatorship. They felt like they had earned it. They didn't necessarily result in the changes that they wanted, but they came back and they have a dramatic impact on society. And certainly, in my own book, the impact of veterans inside the Gulag. So those who were arrested after the war, many for the fact that they had been POWs during the war, bring this incredibly different attitude to prisoner society. And, you know, and so I think we should expect these kinds of impacts. And of course, not just in Russia. We've talked a lot about Russia today, but Ukraine's going to be dramatically affected by all of this as well. And so, you know, even if we can hopefully imagine a world in which Ukraine is victorious, what Ukraine is going to go through, not just in terms of reconstruction and all of these kinds of things, but what it's going to go through societally, with all of these people who've experienced what they've experienced, it's going to be dramatic and it's going to be long lasting. Robert, go ahead. You wanted to jump in again?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think one of the other things that happened at the end of World War II, the returning Soviet officers and soldiers, they were allowed to bring back a lot of the, how shall I put it, deficitni produkty. Yeah, that they had gathered in countries that had even wartime Germany that had a much higher standard of living. And by way of anecdote, I know well, the gentleman's dead now, but he was a colonel during World War II in the Soviet Army, and he came back with a beautiful Renaissance tapestry, which was hanging on the apartment wall. And well, what they call a gobelin. And I don't think it was something that he had purchased. I guess so. I think there was that sort of helped as well. With the returning Ukrainian veterans, which Cynthia mentioned, one of the things that I understand is that there is a feeling that there may be some pressure from the returning veterans for certain societal transformations. Maybe a Ukraine that'll be less corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe one that'll be a bit more open. The oligarchs will play less of a role. There'll be less stealing. So we will see.
Yeah, I think Zelensky is really trying to emphasize the anti-corruption aspect now. I mean, he has to, in the face of what, you know, Ukraine is needing in terms of foreign support, right? He's got to ensure that the Ministry of Defense in particular is honest. And I think he's facing external pressure to do that. But, you know, I think it's going to be a very interesting and hopefully positive situation to watch Ukraine's evolution, because on the one hand, you're going to have, you know, victory by a president who has championed like the national identity of Ukraine as being one like grounded in multi-ethnicity tolerance and if you look at Zelensky's like first New Year's Eve address right after his election, I think I maybe mentioned this last semester, but it's incredibly powerful because he shows a pastiche of Ukrainian people, like all saying like, I'm a Ukrainian, but they're saying it like in English and in Ukrainian and Russian and Tatar, you know, and all these different languages. And he's emphasizing that, you know, you can be living abroad, you can be at home, that this is an identity that you can still have access to. And it was very, very forward looking and you know, it was a whole address that was styled by Western PR companies. And in that sense, like it had this kind of input from them as well. And it'll be interesting to see if those ideals can be sustained in the face of people's, you know, anger at like freaking everything they love being destroyed. When I think about my wonderful student who spoke to you guys, you know, I know that he is worried about the possibility of hatred becoming like the unifying feature of Ukrainian national identity for the foreseeable future. And that is not what Zelensky purported to stand for initially, but it might be unavoidable.
Jeffrey.
Yeah, sustainability of this war is a general question, because it is at this point a war of attrition. So we've talked about already more than 200,000 Russian soldiers having been killed, more than 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers having been killed, more than 70,000 Ukrainian civilians having been killed, and whether this is sustainable for how long, and also how long is it sustainable for the US and the European countries to support the Ukrainians in this effort. We already see in the US Congress some people who are opposed to further budget allocations for assistance to Ukraine. And the US is obviously leading the support to Ukraine, but if the US falters, so will the Europeans. And we've already seen how the Germans were wavering about supplying tanks, for example, and even the US promises of military support are such that it may be too little too late. You know, the tanks won't arrive for months. Well, you know, if the Russians are planning a spring offensive in the next 2 months, you know, tanks that might arrive 8 or 10 months from now are not going to be helpful in that sense. So whether it's military support or economic support or political support on the part of the West to the Ukrainians versus what you have just been discussing in terms of the domestic political support in Russia, you know, all wars come to an end, but the question is sustainability and how long that might occur. I think these are important questions to investigate in more detail.
Absolutely. I mean, these are obviously the kinds of things I was trying to indicate in some of my opening comments today. You know, I want to also acknowledge Patricia has a really good question in the chat, I think along some of these same kinds of lines, mentioning, of course, that the new president of Brazil is not openly supportive of Ukraine, but also this question of the international community and where they're heading. And, you know, I think this is one of the things that we'll certainly be trying to get at with a lot of the guests that we're going to have come, who are going to be specialists on other parts of the world. And to get their sense of how this war is viewed in some of these other countries. It won't be the only question that we're going to be talking to them about, but it's certainly going to be an important one, I think. Bob, you had your hand up for a minute. Did you want to jump in?
I guess, I don't know if this question is answerable, which is why I put the hand down. But, you know, like Cynthia, you mentioned the Putin's mansion, and that's useful because it shows mass corruption. And obviously, you saw Zelensky try to, you know, show the horrors of what the Russian troops were doing in Ukraine. So the act of getting stuff in the media is useful. And I'm just wondering that at the very beginning of the war, before the war, even the Biden administration was leaking a lot of stuff what the CIA knew, and you know, trying even to get the Ukrainians to become more aware. And I'm wondering, you know, you would think that the CIA or NSA or FBI or whatever would know how much corruption has been going on in the Russian military, which is why they started off so poorly in the first place. So many millions of dollars sucked off by various generals and so much. And why we don't see more reports about that? Because it seems that would be a useful way of blunting, you know, Russian support for the military, because, you know, their money is being spent on, you know, mansions or, like you said, tapestries or whatever it may be. So I'm just surprised that there hasn't been more leaking from our own intelligence community, purposeful intelligence community about this kind of stuff.
I think that that's a phenomenal point. I actually think that we have failed to come up with a better strategy of, say, trying to win hearts and minds inside Russia. I think, again, I hope I'm just not repeating myself incessantly, but something I was thinking a lot about last semester were the tactics that the Allies used in fighting World War II, and really trying to use like the BBC, and actually Voice of America was developed, like was grounded in the middle of the war, I think in 1942 or maybe 42 or 43. Again, specifically by trying to with the mission to try to broadcast like kind of Western, interpretations of what was happening in the Second World War into Germany, right? And one of the things that they really attempted to emphasize was this idea that like the German people are good, only the Nazi leadership is bad. And again, we don't have to agree with this model. Like society creates its state, like in a way there's like, people are kind of implicated in their regime, or maybe that's like an interesting question to like, reflect on. But the strategy of like the British and the Americans was to broadcast all of these messaging into Nazi Germany, sort of trying to get ordinary people to like want to challenge their regime and want to see themselves as like not part of this like evil government that's doing these things, like, leading the Holocaust and such. And I've always felt that there we could be doing sort of more with Russia in that way. And like you said, trying to get more messaging into Russia, even in Russian, right? Like about, say, the corruption of the army, or the way like I did the exact same thing. Russian military leaders have been stealing from their own government, and thus, like people have been dying. Russians are dying because of the corrupt actions of Russian generals. I think that is like a great PR point, and that we're just not investing in that kind of PR right now. And I don't really understand why. And then just to get back super briefly to the point about money, like, again, I think this is Steve's key point, and it is a crucial point going forward. Putin is banking on like authoritarian regimes being stronger than democratic regimes, or just having ways of, keeping people in line when the going gets rough. And there is no question that this war is like crazy. It's like crazy money. And I don't remember like how much we were spending a day on the Iraq war, which I guess was also crazy money too. But right now, Ukraine is spending about $6.8 billion a month on keeping its own society running, which I think is about $2 billion, and then in mounting a war effort. And, and we are about to pledge what will be then a total of $105.5 billion. And that's a lot of money. I mean, and it's not something we have to pay all at once and so on. But I tell my students, generosity is easy when it doesn't take away from your own welfare, right? If I have 8,000 loaves of bread, like, please take a loaf of bread, right? That's going to go stale before I can eat it all. But if I have one loaf of bread and haven't eaten for a week, like that's when generosity really hits. Like, am I going to say, hey, Steve, have half my loaf of bread because I know you haven't eaten for a week too? Or, even a slice, somehow gets like more fraught at that stage. And so I do wonder, even in our democracy, again, like what happens when citizens have to undergo economic hardship. And certainly the Russian media is full of stories about the parlous economic situation in the United States and the weakness of our president. I mean, they have all of these sound bites of Biden, and they say like funny but sad, and they show these malapropisms that he, is sometimes committing in public. And so this whole idea of kind of laying the groundwork for that in a lot of ways echoes Soviet propaganda about the West, right? That we are inherently selfish, materialistic, We don't care about something unless we see direct material interest for ourselves. And right now we're divided. So in a weird way, the Russian government is much more effectively like talking about our society than we are talking about the problems in Russian society. And that is probably, I hadn't really occurred to me in that way before, but that is probably something really worth thinking about.
So we're running out of time. Just to let you guys know that Cynthia and I basically talked, we're going to plan these to run from 1 to 2 o'clock. But with the idea that if we're really engaged in the discussion, we'll run over. We're going to make 2:15 an absolute stop point, in part because as we invite guests, we don't want to, keep them longer than what we've promised to them. Let me just give one last thought, if I can, just thinking about this question of information available to the Russian public. And, I don't think we should lose sight of actually some quite significant successes on the part of Navalny and his crew. There have been 124 million views, I think it was, when I pulled up Putin's palace to share the link with everybody. So it's obviously something that's been seen a lot. And it is very interesting that the Navalny team clearly made a strategic decision that focusing on corruption was the most effective way of trying to undermine the Putin regime. They have taken a significant amount of criticism, and in some ways rightfully so, from Ukrainians for the fact that they don't focus on the sort of imperialist nature of the Putin government. This is, I think, clearly a strategic decision taken by Navalny and his group. But there is this kind of information that is out there. And so I do, wonder to what extent we, the United States government or others can add to that in a meaningful way. It's out there and available on, internet sources if people want to go looking for it. But it is, I think, without question, it is the control over television media that is still the predominant media space in many respects in Russia today. That's going to be much more difficult to overcome. But anyway, lots of great questions for us to continue to think and to talk about. Yolanda, I think we're completely in line with you that the cost of not funding now would only go up into the future. And, we are wholeheartedly supporters of Ukraine in their fight in this war. Again, so grateful to see so many people back with us, so many familiar faces. We look forward to continuing to do this. I'll try to share more information on our guests as we get them confirmed. And we look forward to seeing everybody back again in a week.
And we encourage you to ask questions. I mean, don't be afraid to speak up, but at least put something in the chat. But we're all learning, right? We're all learning.
Absolutely. And please do share with your friends, invite them. We'd love to grow the size of the audience a bit, but we hit 70 at one point today. I'm so amazed.
Wow.
So take care, everybody. Have a great week. And we'll see you next Friday.
Thank you so much. Thank you.